Hello everyone. Today in this video we will be covering the topic of the IR spectrum, and we will be studying what the IR spectrum looks like. Now basically the IR spectrum is divided into two portions. The first half is called the functional group region, and the second half is called the fingerprint region. Now each of these regions have specific wave numbers allotted to their respective regions. The fingerprint region has ranges from 600 centimeters inverse to 1400 centimeters inverse. So 1400 centimeters inverse would be somewhere over here. The functional group region has ranges from 1400 centimeters inverse to 4000 centimeters inverse. Now in the fingerprint region you will find complex functional group containing compounds, and in the functional group region you will find polar compounds or compounds that are termed as IR active. These are what are found in this functional group region. An example of a functional group that lies in the fingerprint region is carbon-oxygen single bond. This functional group lies in the fingerprint region of the IR spectrum. All other functional groups which we have studied in the previous video lie in the functional group region. Now, basically, after having studied this IR spectrum, we have to study the graphs that can come in the exam. Okay, now this is one type of the graph that can come in the exam. They can either have the x-axis labeled as wave numbers. The x-axis will always be labeled as wave numbers. Okay, keep that in mind. But the y-axis are what differ. On the left hand side you can see that the y-axis has been labeled as percentage transmittance, but on the right hand side they have been labeled as percentage absorbance. Now the labeling of the wave numbers on the x-axis are always in a descending order. We studied that, right? So it starts from 4000 and it goes on till 500, and that is the same case in the right hand side graph also. But the y-axis labeling depends on what the y-axis represents. If the y-axis represents percentage transmittance, the labeling will start from 0 and it will go on till 100. Okay, so it's going to go ascending. But if the y-axis is labeled as percentage absorbance, the labeling will start from 100 and it will go till 0. So the labeling basically shifts, it changes sides if our y-axis is labeled percentage absorbance instead of percentage transmittance. So this is something to notice. So make sure that you always see what the y-axis represents and what it is labeled as, okay, when you are answering questions in the exam. Now to look at the IR spectrum in more detail, we have to study some of the peaks that can show in the exam. Let's look at the graph on the left hand side first. Now the first one, this one, is basically a weak peak. That is the name given to this peak, okay, and it's weak because it's having a very small peak. Okay, now the second peak is called a medium peak because it is somewhere in the middle between the first and the third one, and the third one is called a strong peak. These are the terminologies given. Okay, now what does weak mean? Let's look into that. Weak means that it is less transmitted. So the functional group that would have this kind of a peak would be transmitting less energy or less wavelengths. But if we have a strong peak, that would mean K, the functional group is transmitting a lot of energy. That is what the weak and the strong peaks represent. Okay. Now, what if we look at the graph on the right hand side? The first part of this graph, this part is broad, because you can see that visually it is broad, but it is also strong, right? If we look at strong over here, if we look at strong, can't we say that this is also strong? We can, right? Because it goes to a very big depth. Okay, so this is broad and strong. Okay, the first part of the graph. Now after that, let's look at the second part of the graph, which is this part. Now this part is going to be called narrow, because it is narrow, and it is also going to be called strong. Why? Because again it seems to be transmitting a lot of energy. So this is called narrow and strong. Okay, so broad means, what does broad mean? Broad basically means that it is absorbing wavelengths over a wider range, right? Because you can see that the wave number is being covered a lot. Okay, so it's absorbing over a wider range. What does narrow and strong mean? It means that it is absorbing over a narrow range. This can also be called sharp and strong. That is another word that can be given to this. It is sharp because it is being covered over a very narrow range of wave numbers. Okay, and with this we conclude the chapter of infrared spectrum. In the exam, the only questions that are asked are on the identification of basic functional groups with reference of the data numbers from the data booklet which is provided in the exam. So all you have to do is you have to know how to identify these graphs, you have to know the fingerprint and functional group region, and you have to be able to look into the data booklet for the specific wave numbers. Thank you.